Charles, so welcome back to our After Hours, and we obviously had a great conversation with you earlier in the episode, and I want to continue that. But before we get there, I wanted to just touch on the fact that you're someone that has traded, but you live in Hawaii, and I wanted to know, how do you follow the markets in that time zone? Like how is that for you, being out in Hawaii and keeping an eye on what's going on in the world, out on the at least on the East Coast?
Yeah, well, that's thank you for the question. And yeah, in Hawaii does not have daylight savings time like the mainland, and so the time difference between the New York and Hawaii changes by an hour, depending on daylight savings. So when it's a 3 hour difference to California from Hawaii, which is kind of the standard, then the market opens at 3:30 a.m.
Right.
It's
Uh,
like the worst. It's the worst time you could ask for. Like it's almost like the most. Like I love Hawaii, Charles. I think it's the greatest place on the planet. I think it's just it's wonderful. But if you said to me, what is the absolute worst time zone to live in? I think I would choose Hawaii.
Yeah, in terms of being a day trader or really having to focus on markets, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a bit much. I mean, in Honolulu, in the more expensive homes are in the hills, and so that's where my brother and sister-in-law live. And so you hear the Beamers and the brokers and so on coming down the hill at 3, 4 in the morning.
Really?
But
They
yeah,
honestly they
yeah,
get up and they go to
yep,
work.
yep, they have
Oh
to.
wow,
That's
I didn't know that.
that's
I
being a
I had no
trooper.
idea. Yeah, like when you used to see a Bill Gross on TV looking haggard, getting up at 4 in the morning to do it from the West Coast. That's nothing compared to these guys.
Yeah, and I guess I'm not so much into day trading, so on occasion I will, if I really want to get a trade in the first half hour. And the old rule of thumb, you don't trade in the first 5 minutes. Let the market bubble along for at least 20, 30 minutes, right? So I sometimes I'll get up at 4, but that's rare. And most of the time I'm kind of a long-term guy, so I try not to get whipsawed too much by the daily stuff. But yeah, it would be
Well,
brutal if you were trying to day trade.
But
so now
the advantage on the other side, though, is that the market closes just after breakfast for you, and then you're basically free for the rest of the day, right?
Yeah, you lick your wounds for like a half hour till 10:30, and then you go, oh heck. um,
so so Charles, do you live on the Big Island?
yes, I do.
Okay, so I actually love the Big Island. We went and climbed the into the volcano, and it's just a wonderful place. I think it's the only place around, or it's one of the few places that has all five out of the seven climate zones in one spot. Is it something like that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there is
Yeah.
snow on the big volcanoes, and or you can just go down and yeah, I'm glad you went to the volcano. It's been active, as you know. It stopped now about 6 months ago, or maybe more. But yeah, it's
People
lively.
people don't realize it, but actually Mauna Kea, or if I said that right, is actually taller than Everest. And everyone says, "Oh, whoa, whoa, that's not right. Everest is so high." And it's like Everest is higher, but it's not taller. So if you look at from sea level to the top of Mauna Kea, it's actually that distance is higher or larger than the Everest.
Yeah, that's right. Measured from the bottom of the seafloor. Yeah. So, well, I'm glad you got to visit Hawaii. I know that's a long haul from Toronto.
It sure is. Okay, so let's
So
talk a little bit markets. We've probably had enough of, everyone's going to be
yeah,
jealous of you. We don't need to hear any more about living the good life in Hawaii.
no,
Oh, it's
so
hard. It's really hard, though. I mean,
oh
there's
yeah,
no extremes of temperature and stuff to keep you alert. So
so Charles, I wanted to actually talk to you a little bit about this. You've written about it before, about deglobalization and this idea. Like, I mean, one of the big trends over the last 20, 30 years was moving to globalization, and so now that trend has seemed to reverse. So, what's your feeling about how this is all developing?
Well, that's a great topic, and I want to comment first and just appreciation of your guys' informality and the range of topics you're willing to discuss. I find that really refreshing. So, the way I look at deglobalization is there's a couple of different factors powering it. One is, of course, the eclipse of the nation state. And this is where the so-called populism and nationalism is arising as people are starting to realize the nation state serves a purpose because its ultimate purpose is to protect its citizenry, right? And so globalization sort of acts to erode that nation state concept, right? Because it's all supposed to be open borders and capital has no borders and serves no masters except the owners of capital and so on. And that's great in a sort of boost phase, if you will, of capitalism or global capitalism, in the sense that a lot of places like China, why was China poor? Okay, they had really poor policies, but they were starved for capital, right? And that was true of the Asian tigers and many other nations, right? And so when you open the borders to capital, you suddenly get capital that can be invested productively in these capital starved economies. And then you get this really solid broad-based growth that everybody loves. Everybody's making more money. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. But when you get to extremes of global capital, then it starts becoming dysfunctional, right? And so then you start getting exploitation and other bad effects, and that's where we've seen in the States where there's a number of people. I think less so in Canada, but certainly around the world, the idea that globalization has cost us jobs and it's stripped away the middle class and it's created or added to this winner take most economy. So that's part of it. And I think also that I often refer to a chart, the S curve, um, which often describes natural systems like the infection rates of a bacteria or something like that. And what it is there's this boost phase, the part of the S, and then stuff rises very quickly, and then it kind of tops out and stagnates, and then it declines. And so that's kind of what I see as the return on globalization has now decayed to where in many cases it's now negative. So it's really not making financial sense anymore.
Right. And so I wanted to move on because, I mean, earlier you touched on asset prices and negative interest rates. And one of the reasons interest rates have been able to been maintained at such low levels is that there's been very little to almost no inflation. And in fact, some would argue that there's natural deflationary forces in play. But how do you think this plays out in the bigger picture? Because I know Kevin over here believes that there's a hidden inflation that will emerge at some point, and it's going to wreak havoc on everything. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Kev, but I think I'm
Oh
pretty
no,
right.
that's fine. I agree. I just don't like the hidden part, but otherwise, I think.
Well, yeah, but on the other hand, those people that are see this massive amount of debt and the fact that so many people have to service this debt, a lot, especially a lot of overtapped consumers, that this has them spend less, and it's actually a natural deflationary force within the system. So, what's your take on inflation, deflation? How does this play out in your mind?
Well, that's a terrific topic, and I'm glad that you guys have you've kind of covered both sides of it because we've all had this same debate for 10 years, right? I mean, or 15 years. It's like, well, why which is going to win, inflation or deflation? And how come we don't have inflation despite all this fiscal and monetary stimulus? And of course, we all know the general answer is, well, we do have inflation, but it's in asset valuations, right? All the money that's been printed or borrowed has flowed into, or much of it has flowed into assets. And so that's why we get these crazy valuations of, Beyond Meat and, any house in the Bay Area here in the San Francisco Bay Area is, worth an absurd amount of money, at least on its market valuation. And so we have had inflation. It's just been pouring into assets where this speculative bubble that mentality that I've described as the result of zero interest rate policy So that's one answer. The other answer is the authorities are purposefully understating inflation. And, we all know that if you use hedonics and a variety of other kind of trickery, then you can really underestimate inflation. And one of my favorite tricks that they use here in the U.S. is they have the basket of goodies that are in the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, right? And so, what they do is they minimize the size of the sector. So, healthcare, which is roughly 19% of the U.S. GDP, right? I mean, it's on the order of, I don't know, 3 to 4 trillion. Well, it's something like 6% of the CPI. Well, it's like, well, wait a minute. It's like, how did they figure that? It's 19% of GDP and it's like some trivial amount of CPI. And they do the same thing with higher education, right? In other words, if people are actually paying for college, it's a huge hit. It's a huge percentage of their income and spending, and yet it's some trivial percentage of the CPI. So that's why I think more rational, um, uh, estimates of inflation are more on the order of 6 to 7%, not 1 to 2 or 3%. So
Yeah.
that's
So
the other
Charles,
answer.
yeah, Charles, I just want to, sorry to interrupt you there, but like the other thing that I find crazy about the way they adjust those is they'll say something like your iPad is twice as fast, so
Yeah,
therefore it's really gone down in half value. Or they'll look at like the average car. The average car used to have, I don't know, 200 horsepower. Now it has 300. I don't know what the numbers are, but and they'll say your car is a third better. I mean, a half better, and you're
Right,
just like, what?
and
Like,
also, Kev, they'll do things like substitution. So if the price of steak has gone up, they'll say that you get the same
yeah.
utility out of ground beef, and they'll substitute like something that's equivalent into the basket. Even though rather than tracking just the one item, so it is a political vehicle, like the calculation. But what's interesting about it is that, like, when I was speaking with like Russell Napier, he was saying that the problem is that that's what we use because it's got the longest history behind it. It's like there's no real acceptable academic way of measuring inflation that they have a large data sample for, and so everyone just keeps sticking with CPI, even though everyone at the academic level accepts that it's a flawed measure of inflation, right?
right, right. Of course, as you guys know, there's other attempts, right? The Million Price Project of MIT and so on. Well, let's talk a little bit. You mentioned the iPad and stuff like that. So let's talk about technology a bit. I'd like to hear what you guys have to say about this because technology is generally enormously deflationary, right? Because everything does get faster, better, cheaper. But as you guys raised the subject, automobiles, for example, are a perfect example that there's more chips in a car now than there is in a computer, right? I mean, it's got way more semiconductors, but the sticker price to the consumer keeps going up. So it's
Right.
not cheaper. It may be better, but it's not cheaper. So is it deflationary or not? I mean, how do we measure that?
Yeah, I don't think it is. Like, I think that's bullshit, and it's keeping the CPI down much more than it should be, and that really we're experiencing way more inflation than we would have ever guessed. And
But
when you go look at the shadow statistics and stuff, there's a fellow that keeps
yeah,
I can't remember the
Williams,
fellow's name, but he just
Williams.
says he just says let's just leave the system as is, and we'll use the way we used to calculate CPI. And if you do that, I think we're running 4 or 5%. And then if we do that, and if you use the real number, you'll realize why the current financial system and where we have interest rates set is so financially repressive, because
Absolutely,
in real terms,
it's the theft of capital.
yeah,
Yeah,
It's
and
exactly. Well,
yeah.
let's on the same kind of topic, I'm curious what you guys see happening to employment and household income because we all know inflation is running hotter than the official statistic, and yet wages are the one thing that's not going up, right? For like something like 90% of the people, right? Or 80 to 90%, right? When we compare like the past periods of inflation, such as the 70s, wages were going up lockstep, right? And for the
But
last
was it?
yeah, go
Yeah, but
ahead.
wasn't that Charles? Sorry to interrupt, but wasn't
No,
that just isn't that a function of globalization? Like you go look,
yeah,
we had two huge things occur in the 90s, which was one, the fall of the Berlin Wall, or late 80s, and then also China, entering the WTO.
yeah,
Both of those were huge supply shocks to labor. So
yeah,
all
no,
of a sudden we
absolutely.
had, hundreds of millions of people competing for, on the labor side, and then we wonder why there's no wage inflation. Well, the reality is that though there's been a huge increase in supply,
And
and
also,
and
you have to add this technology to that, where as soon as you start putting wage pressure, there becomes an increasing incentive for businesses to find technological alternatives to paying higher wages, but rather making everyone more efficient and needing less labor,
So, but
right?
Patrick, I don't buy that argument, and I'll tell you why. Because everyone has been saying that for hundreds of years. They used to say that about whatever it was they were building at the time. And the
Right.
reality is that jobs will change, and you need to make it so people can change. But to say that we shouldn't continue to make our economy more productive through technology because it
I'm
might
not
cost
saying that,
somebody
but I'm just saying that that's definitely one of the drivers as to
I think though
why
a
we
proper
have not
functioning
seen
Yeah, but
wage inflation.
a properly functioning economy should just have you should retrain that worker, and there should be a new job that opens up for something else. And so I'll give you an example. Everyone goes on. I see on Zero Hedge they talk all the time about the McDonald's kiosks that are causing all sorts of teenagers from being laid off. I spoke to the McDonald's up in my cottage country, and the lady that ran it, the manager, told me that she said they'd never been busier and they had to hire more people because the reality is the people preferred to come and go order from the kiosk because there's a higher chance to get the order quick, better. And so they actually found themselves busier and were hiring more people. So I think it's a very slippery slope to just say, "Oh, this is going to cause the computers are going to replace people, and therefore there's going to be less jobs." I think we just have to work a little harder on figuring out how to make the society more productive on the
Like
whole.
Kev, I don't think that anyone disagrees with you in that sense, but I mean, ultimately, we there has not been any wage inflation, and so the question is why not? And
But it's
I
back
think
to
that
my thing. I think it has more to do with China and the fall of the Berlin Wall. But Patrick, you and I are arguing. We should really ask Charles what he
Yeah.
thinks.
Well, I'm I'm loving the exchange because I think that's what you guys have each proposed is like critical context, right? And so I would just kind of add that that we have to bring capital into the picture. And so when capital is really expensive, like you got to pay 10% to borrow, then you're going to go, well, gosh, maybe I can train this worker and increase productivity that way. That's the cheaper alternative. But when you can borrow for a 1%, then you go, well, I'll just throw this money in automation. And so I think there's that element of it. And the between capital and labor being productive with super low interest rates, capital now has the advantage, right? Because if you're in business, then you'll go, well, gosh, if I can replace some labor with some automation that I can buy with at basically zero interest, that's going to be more attractive than if I had to pay 5, 6, 8, 10%. I want to raise another topic, related to this. Is like there's an economist who won the Nobel Prize, Michael Spence, and I think one of the reasons he won the prize was he talked about tradable and untradeable labor, right? So that and what globalization affects is the tradable stuff, the iPads and so on. It doesn't affect the McDonald's that we're talking about because you can't get the McDonald's hamburger shipped from China, right? And you can't get your hair cut, and there's just a million things that are untradeable or non-tradable, and so my what I'm trying to learn and trying to focus on is the idea that um, maybe the labor force is maybe there's actually a surplus of people who can do the non-tradable work, right? And so there's even though we keep hearing about labor shortages, and those are real, if you're an employer, definitely real, at least in the U.S. and probably in Canada as well. But it may very well be that the kind of labor that the jobs are available in are just not very productive, and so you can't pay more than $15 an hour because it's just not worth more in the market. And so
Well,
that may be one reason why labor value is capped. That's all. That's all I wanted to say.
yeah, I hear what you're saying. I feel like sometimes nobody's willing to raise prices because we've got into a deflationary mindset. And the reality is that with globalization and with China beating at your door and with everything coming down in price, it's made it so we can't ever, like, no company thinks they can raise prices. So therefore, they never go and decide to compete by competing by like paying their workers more. And I've increasingly seen more politicians, and I just saw something about Quebec. That's a province up here in Canada,
Right.
and there was a premier that said something to the effect is, you guys are all complaining about, he's talking to the business community. He says, you guys are all complaining that you can't find workers. Well, why don't you try raising your prices? And I think that there's been like this kind of, I don't know, mindset shift, like that the reality is that nobody's had to pay up and compete for workers for so long that nobody's willing to do it. And the question I have for you is, what if we get into a situation with globalization going the other way, when all of a sudden it shifts and inflation does take off, even though Patrick tells us there's no way it can? Could you see a situation where next thing you know, people are competing to try to hire workers, and we do get that inflation that we seemed so elusive for so long? Like, what do you give the chances of that happening?
Yeah, I think that's a great topic, and I appreciate you asking it because on many, when you look at, like Patrick mentioned, the debt load and the fact that, say, if there's just a normal sort of signal noise of defaults, then that could really bring down asset prices, or at least in terms of housing and so on. That's one factor. But we also maybe want to look at demographics in the context you just described, like what could cause labor inflation as well as product inflation. In terms of labor inflation, a shrinking workforce would really do the trick, and that's exactly what we have in Japan, and now China is entering a demographic decline. Their workforce is shrinking for the first time in decades, and the U.S. and Canada are escaping that only because we have really high immigration rates. But Europe, of course, is way down that demographic slide already. And so then, if your workforce shrinks, then you really will have to bid up for labor, even at the lowest skill level. But I think another factor is the what can't be automated and what can be automated. And I talked about this in one of my books called Get a Job and Build a Real Career in a Bewildering Economy, because that was my attempt to, like, provide some sort of advice to people that were entering the workforce or needed to do a midlife change. Was, well, you know what? There's different productivity, different valuation placed on different kinds of labor, right? And so clearly you're in a losing game with tradable stuff. If you're going to be making stuff that can be made anywhere in the world that's fully commoditized, that's going to be tough to do with labor, right? Because as you guys said, the labor's cheaper elsewhere. But if you can provide some kind of value that's non-tradable, and that's very high productivity and so on, like specialty welding and stuff like that, these guys are getting big bucks. And my niece's husband is a specialty welder, and so he can work anywhere and earn a very good salary because his skill set cannot be automated. You can automate
Right.
welding on a factory floor, but when you're going to crawl into the belly of some, like, barge or something like that, sorry, the robot's out.
Right, right.
Okay, so Charles, before we wrap up here, I see that you are a musician. I go on your
Well,
blog and I see
yeah.
you got some original music and stuff. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how your musical interests, what you do and what you play? I take it you're a guitar player. Do you also sing?
Well, poorly at both. Yeah. If you listen to any of the recordings, you can tell I'm just, if there's 100 million guitar players, I'm in the bottom 5 million or whatever. But I have fun with it, and of course, I try to avoid that huge battle. It's like it's almost like Democrats and Republicans or something, right? In the guitar world, you can be either you play a Les Paul or you play, a Stratocaster, right? And so I like them both. Okay, I'm really sorry, I
Uh,
don't choose sides. I my picture on the
I
blog shows me with my Les Paul, which is a fine instrument, but I often play a Strat. So okay,
I
I'm
thought you were gonna say. I thought you were gonna say acoustic or electric because I'm an acoustic guy and I just can't get myself around. I try on the electric. I'm just a rhythm acoustic kind of campfire guitar player, so that's all I can do. But do you also do acoustic?
Oh yeah, I have a couple of acoustics, a Spanish and a Gibson. So no, I love acoustic. I usually play acoustic because then I have to fuss around with chords and don't worry about the neighbors banging on the wall or anything.
So, what's your go-to campfire song?
I and well, I would say Country Road or whatever the name of it is by
Oh,
John
yeah,
Denver.
yeah.
And the reason why is a lot of people go, oh God, I've heard that a million times or so on. But if back when I first went to China in like 2000, which is almost 20 years ago, then that was the American song that was on a karaoke machine or that people knew in China. Now, of course, now they're much
Ah,
more sophisticated and so on. So you could sing Country Road and everyone would, oh, I get it. Okay, I heard that. Yeah.
That's funny.
What's yours? You probably have a much better one.
oh. No, I don't know. I'm a big Beatles fan, so it'd probably be a Beatles tune. Or actually, I like Bob Seger seems to be like a lot of Bob Seger tunes are easy to play, and I find that that's probably so maybe Against the Wind or something like that would be one of mine that I would choose. Something that doesn't take the just CG F or whatever it is. Something nice and simple.
Yeah, no, that would be a great choice. Whenever I hear a Bob Seger song, I always think, wow, that's really well crafted. It's like a classic hook and terrific lyrics. Those are good songs. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's
See,
I think
I don't play guitar, but if I am at a campfire, the one I always sing is Dennis Leary's "I'm an Asshole." It's just it just feels so right for me. It's
Yeah.
no, come on, yeah,
it's a great
no, but
song. I love to sing it. It's
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that I think what we're if I can kind of broaden the thing we're talking about is like, that's one thing that a lot of people, including me, are worried about is, we're all worried about teaching our kids to code, like we gotta be technological marvels and it's all like, well, wait a minute, what about like all the other skill sets that are part of intelligence, right? And problem solving and music and art and that kind of stuff are definitely part of our whole intellectual skill set, and so yeah, we it's part of being creative. I think is so important. I'm sure you guys do too. I mean, you need that break from staring at charts and reading economics and stuff, right? You bring a different kind of intuitiveness to it. I think it's really
Oh yeah.
valuable.
So Charles, I'll tell you, I played a little guitar as a kid, and then my daughter was learning, and she was in high school at the time, and she had the guitar teacher come over, and to do lessons, and I said, "Do you teach adults?" And he says, "Yeah, sure." And I said, "Okay, I've always wanted to do this," and I loved it because for an hour or whenever I was playing guitar, especially at the beginning, it took every piece of my concentration to learn to form those neuron paths and to learn the new skill. And I found that I would forget every whatever the yen was doing or whatever bonds were going up in my face. I all those disappeared because I was learning this new skill, and I was actually kind of disappointed when I got good enough that I actually could think about my problems and actually play guitar.
No, that I totally hear you. And in fact, I've been so frustrated by the inability, like my fingers just can't hit that weird chord and I'm like nearly weeping with frustration, right? But that's all good stuff. Well, the other thing is you guys living in Toronto, you've got nature relatively close by, right? And you've got a lot of places you can go where there's not a ton of people, right? I mean, I know it's a great city, but when you want to get out
well,
into the wilds, you got a lot of choices, right? And I think that's another thing that's undervalued. And I'm saying that I just came back from a 5-day camping trip in the Sierra, and it was all like, wow, this is so great. No Wi-Fi, you know, and we
You
count.
know what's interesting?
Yeah,
I saw a study. I saw a study the other day about walking, and walking is obviously more important. Is very important in terms of your health benefits. But walking in nature is actually one of the. It has a dramatically increased health benefit versus walking like in New York City, which I would have never imagined. There's something happens in your brain.
Yeah, that's great information. But we're not surprised, right? Because why wouldn't we respond to nature as opposed to a noisy, smoggy city? Yeah. So what we're really saying, guys, is we're saying if you want to become a better trader, then take a walk in nature and play some music.
You got it. Well, Charles, it was a pleasure having you on. Why don't you tell everyone where they can find you again one last time?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com. Lots of free stuff on the site. Lots of stuff to amuse and annoy you, and free samples of my free chapters of my most recent books.
Well,
nice.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure meeting you, Charles, and we look forward to having you on again sometime.
Thank you,
I would
Charles.
love it. Thank you.
All right, cheers.
Thank you.
All right, Charles, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Hey, you guys are terrific. I have to say, I've had I've been a guest on a lot of different shows, and I just love your guys' ability to hit the really good hard topics, but do so.
Lena, don't cut
informally.
this out. Leave this in, Lena.
That's very kind of you.
Yeah,
Charles, you did a great job. I could tell it's easy with a guest like you because you obviously have done this before, and I could tell it was easy. You just point you in the right direction and you take off.
Having a beer or two helps too.
Oh,
That's
absolutely.
Right. You don't realize we're already half in the bag by the time we start this, Charles.
But it only gets better, Then we're gonna get more audience. Well, I had a list of 11 topics, so I was never gonna run out of something to talk about.
Okay. Anyways. Okay. Well, it was a pleasure meeting you. Thanks again, Charles.
Okay.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
All right, cheers.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.